Okay, so so just before the break, we were talking about how this school, the Vaibhashika school, has this belief that there are these partless particles of matter, which can't be broken down further, and also partless moments of mind or consciousness. I mean, but this is actually something really, really brief. But still, it's indivisible, partless, basic phenomena, which then builds up to become larger ones. So this view is not held by the higher schools, the Madhyamika school, for example, which the Tibetans follow, would argue with this view. They refute this idea of partless particles. But anyway, this school apparently believes in it. And in Geshe Tashi's book on the Two Truths, he explains that according to this school, there are these other terms that are used in many of the Buddhist schools. So they're a little bit complicated, but I'll try to explain them. So they say that there's some phenomena which are said to be imputedly existent. They exist imputedly, as opposed to other phenomena which exist substantially. So these terms, imputed existence and substantial existence, are found in many of the Buddhist philosophical texts. And I'll explain what they mean. According to this school, other schools may have different explanations of them. But an example of an imputedly existent phenomena would be a person or a self. Like us. We are persons, we are self. And as I was explaining before, earlier this morning, the way that Buddhism explains a person, how a person exists or what a person is that a person is simply imputed or labeled or named on top of or in relation to the physical and mental phenomena that we are made of, that make us up. Okay, so the Buddha himself spoke about a person in terms of aggregates. Have you heard that term, aggregates? So it seems that this way of describing a person was already existing in India even before the Buddha. So it's a way of dividing a person into these 5 groups of phenomena, 5 categories of phenomena, which are called aggregate. Aggregate just means like a heap or a pile or a collection. Sorry. Throat is itchy. My aggregates are acting up. So, one of the 5 aggregates, the first of the 5 aggregates is called form, and that refers to the body. So all the physical parts of us, our body, our cells, molecules, atoms, so all of that is included in the form aggregate. And then the second aggregate is the feeling aggregate. And that includes all of our feelings. But again, there's a difference between the word feeling as we use it in the West and the way it's used in Buddhism. In the West, feeling can be many different kinds of experiences. But in Buddhism, and talking about these aggregates, there are only 3 types of feeling. That doesn't mean Buddhism doesn't recognize other types of feelings, but they would be categorized elsewhere. So feeling is of 3 types. There's pleasant feeling, unpleasant feeling, and then neutral or neither pleasant nor unpleasant, so somewhere in between. And according to Buddhism, Buddhist psychology, Buddhist explanation of the mind, every single moment, every experience that we have, there's always one of those 3 types of feelings present. So we're never without feelings. We're never feelingless. We always have a feeling. So when we see something, when we hear something, so when we have any sensory experience at all, and also when we think or remember, when we have any kind of mental experience, there's always one of those 3 types of feelings present, either a pleasant or an unpleasant or a neutral feeling. And this is a important topic in Buddhism because it's said that for unenlightened beings, beings who are not enlightened and who are not particularly aware or mindful, when we have a pleasant feeling, we see a beautiful object, for example, and we have a pleasant feeling, then it often leads to attachment, desire, grasping. I'm sorry, I think I'm going to have to take a break.
Yeah, sure.
So I was talking about the feeling aggregate feelings and how this is important because if we are not aware, mindful, careful about what's going on in our mind, then when we have a pleasant feeling, it can lead to attachment or desire, craving, grasping, wanting. I want more of that. And then when we have an unpleasant feeling, we feel, I look at something or look at a person and feel this, then again, if we're not careful, not aware, then that can lead to aversion, anger, hatred, and even further into aggression, violence. And so there's a progression, when a person gets really angry and violent, if it's traced back, it starts with an unpleasant feeling. And often our feelings are not really valid, we just don't feel good about that person, but we don't really check carefully why, if it's true or not, if that person really is bad or threatening. So often people just, immediately get into their emotions and act on their emotions, and often they're wrong. There's really no good reason to feel that way. And then neutral feelings, for unenlightened, unaware, unmindful beings, neutral feelings just tend to perpetuate our ignorance. Because even when we have a neutral feeling, we don't necessarily feel good or bad, we don't get attached or angry, but we're still seeing things in an incorrect way, not in a true way, not as they really are. So the Buddha realized that in ordinary beings, ordinary minds, this is what is going on. Unpleasant feeling leads to anger, hatred. Pleasant feeling leads to attachment, aversion. Neutral feeling just continues our state of being unaware, being ignorant. And so we can't really stop having feelings. It's, even an enlightened being still has feelings. But what we can do is pay attention when our feelings are coming up and try to not let the usual pattern follow of going into attachment and aversion and so on. So this is a very important part of mindfulness practice in Buddhism. Practice of mindfulness ideally should involve paying attention to our mind and noticing our feelings, and then trying to stop the mind from going into the disturbing emotions of attachment and aversion. Yeah. So that's the second aggregate. And then the third aggregate is called discrimination. And discrimination here means that aspect of the mind or that factor of the mind that is able to distinguish one thing from another. Like the word discrimination in our languages often has a somewhat negative connotation, like being discriminating against certain people, discriminating against certain people. So here it doesn't have that kind of connotation. It's just a simple recognition that one thing has certain characteristics that makes it different from another thing. So it's neither good nor bad. In fact, we need it to be able to distinguish one thing from another. That this is red and this is blue, like traffic lights. You have to be able to tell when the light is red and the light is green, otherwise you get into an accident. Or to tell a dog from a cat, or to tell your father from your mother. So it's just the ability to notice certain characteristics or features about an object that enable you to distinguish it from something else. So it's not good or bad, it's just a factor, a faculty of the mind.
This discrimination is in our intelligence or in our mind?
Well, Buddhism doesn't make a distinction between intelligence
Because
and mind.
before you said, at the beginning today, when you got the question on the soul,
Yeah.
you said that there are three different things and the soul is not, and the mind is not produced, neither by the body, neither by our, and I understood intelligence, but I was wrong. Anyway, so this ability of discrimination comes from the mind.
It's part of the mind,
Okay.
yeah. It's a mental factor.
Okay, it's a mental.
It's a mental factor, yeah. Yeah, so actually of the 5 aggregates, the first aggregate is the body, that's the physical part of us. The other 4 aggregates are all parts of the mind.
Okay.
It's just a different way of breaking up the mind. So that's why sometimes people say, well, there's really just 2 things. There's body and mind. But for some reason the Buddha did speak in terms of these 5 aggregates, breaking it down into 5. But it could also be summarized into 2, body and mind. And then the third aggregate is called compositional factors. And that is sort of a basket, you might say, that includes lots of things. All the other mental factors. Feeling is one mental factor, discrimination is one mental factor, and then there are many other mental factors. In our tradition, we usually study, 51 mental factors? I forget now, 51 or 52. Anyway, there's other ways of explaining the mental factors in terms of 49 or 48. There's different numbers, but anyway, there's many of these mental factors. These are different factors of the mind, and some of them are disturbing emotions like anger, attachment, and so forth. So all the delusions or afflictive emotions are mental factors, and they are all included in this 4th aggregate, the compositional factors. So all the mental factors, both virtuous ones, non-virtuous ones, ones that are neither, besides feeling and discrimination. So I hope it's So the first aggregate is form, that includes our body. The second aggregate is feelings, which is a mental factor. Feelings is a mental factor, but it's separated out as a separate aggregate, one of the 5 aggregates. Discrimination is also a mental factor, but it's one whole aggregate of its own. And then all the other mental factors, however many there are, 40 or 50 or whatever, they're all included in the 4th aggregate. Okay, so that's just a basket to fit all the others in. And then the 5th aggregate is consciousness. And that aggregate includes our 6 types of mind, 6 ways of knowing things. 5 of these are related to our senses: seeing, hearing, smell, taste, touch, physical sensations. And then the 6th consciousness is mental consciousness. And that includes thoughts, memories, dreams, emotions, and so forth. So Buddhism says we have 6 consciousnesses, and all those 6 consciousnesses are included in the 5th aggregate of consciousness. So that may sound rather complicated, but there are reasons for dividing it up that way, and in Buddhist philosophy, one kind of studies and learns all of these. But it's also topics for meditation, to be able to look at ourselves and see how we are made up of these different components. Basically body and mind, physical and mental components. I started talking about this in relation to this term imputed existence. So according to Buddhism, a person, myself, yourself, any of us, is composed of these 5 aggregates. And each of these 5 aggregates is composed of many, many things, many parts. Okay? So we are made up of many, many hundreds, thousands, millions, billions of parts, if you really break it down into all the details. Now, is any of these parts, these components, a person, the self? Now we feel, in our own experience of ourself, we feel as if we do have a self. There's a self here. There's a sense of I, a sense of me. You know, me. I'm sitting here and I'm looking at you and talking to you, and you're sitting there looking at me and listening to me and writing notes and so on. So we all have this sense of being here, of being a person, being a self. But what exactly is a self or a person? So this is a really important question in Buddhism. There's a lot of discussion and debate about it, but it's also meant to be meditated on. Because what the Buddha discovered in his practice, his meditation, as he was following his spiritual quest, looking for the way to be free of suffering, what he discovered was that believing in a real self and grasping at that, grasping, I am real, I am a real self, I'm a real me, that is the root of suffering. That is something that leads to all the problems, all the suffering, and continued rebirth, taking birth again and again in the suffering, unenlightened existence. And what he discovered was that it's wrong. Believing in a self is something wrong, something mistaken. This self that we believe in so firmly, so strongly, in fact, doesn't really exist in the way that we see it. Because again, that doesn't mean we don't exist at all. There is no person, there is no self, there's nobody here at all. It doesn't mean that. But the error, the fault, is in the way that we see ourselves, the view. And it's not so much a view in the sense of it's something that we think up deliberately, consciously. You know, we invent this idea of a self. Not like that. And it's also not something we are taught. Although, of course, in our life, in what we learn from our parents, what we learn from school and so forth, the knowledge, the conditioning that we take in does contribute to our sense of self. But Buddhism says we are already born, you know, even when we're still in the womb. Before we come out and see mom and dad and start learning from them, we already have this innate, instinctive sense of self, sense of I, sense of me. I'm a real person here. I really exist, which is erroneous, which is incorrect. Yeah.
Lama Zopa Rinpoche, he says, everybody making the I or the self their boss. Nobody knowing what the I is. Very strange. Very strange.
Making the I the boss, but not knowing what it is. So we believe in the I and we let ourselves be ruled by the I, but we never actually investigate, well, who is this I? Who is this boss? Like that? Is that what it is? Okay.
This is very strange.
Yeah. Very strange. Who's in charge here?
Who is having the realization?
So, I had to put my tissue. So where was I? No, I have one here. So one thing that all the Buddhist schools agree on, they do agree on some things. They have different views on some things, but there are some things they do agree on. So one thing that they all agree on is that there isn't a real self, something that you can find, something you can point to among the aggregates, among all these parts of our body and mind. And this is one thing that distinguished the Buddha and his teachings, his system from others, because at that time when the Buddha was alive and teaching in India, there were many philosophers, yogis, spiritual masters who were teaching and gathering disciples, teaching a doctrine, having a system. And it seems many of them, if not all of them, believed in a self. Actually, that was part of their system. There is a real self, and so that was their teaching. They're actually perpetuating the basic. Like we all people and all beings have a basic inborn, innate, instinctive sense of self, but then on top of that, if we meet with a philosophical system or a religious system that teaches us that we really do have a self, there really is a real self there, then that will just make it more and more concrete and firm. So Buddha discovered in his experience that this was actually incorrect to believe in a self. And that not only was it erroneous, but it's also a cause of suffering. Because by believing I have a real self, a real I, a real me, then we tend to be attached to that self. We tend to become self-focused, self-centered, self-important. And then looking out at the world, relating to other people, relating to the world, then we tend to get into this discriminatory attitude of liking this, not liking that, having attachment to this, having aversion to that. And then those attitudes in turn can lead to many problems and misbehavior, unskillful actions. And that way we create karma. Not only do we sometimes harm others with our actions, but we also create karma, which becomes part of our mental continuum, and then in the future experience problems as a result of the karma that we create. So based on this view of self, we tend to act in ways that create more suffering for ourselves and others. So this is what the Buddha saw in his experience and what he taught. And so his advice was, he didn't say, there's no self and you have to believe it because I said so, because I have this experience. But he said, you investigate it for yourself. Check it out for yourself to see if it's true or not. So this school, the Vibhashika school, says that if we meditate, mainly using mindfulness meditation, just really paying attention to what is going on, moment by moment by moment. Gradually, we will come to see directly with our own experience that there's just this mass of impermanent phenomena, some of them physical phenomena, these little particles of matter, some mental phenomena, these little particles of mind, changing all the time, moment by moment by moment by moment. You come to see directly that that's all there is. And any idea of a real self, a real I, is just mentally created, mentally fabricated, mentally constructed, and not really there, not really true. So even though compared to the Majjhimika view, this view is considered somewhat more gross, more coarse, but it's still helpful for us because we are most probably still, in the situation of, feeling as if there is a real self here somewhere, and haven't really gone through the whole process of investigation to see if this is true or not. So I was thinking to do, maybe it would be helpful to do a meditation on this, just to investigate this this whole topic of a self. So get comfortable as much as you can so that your body can remain still as much as possible during the meditation, because if our body can be still, it's easier for the mind to be still and focused. So it's not absolutely necessary to sit perfectly still and not move, but it's just best to try to not move as much as possible. Try to stay still, and that helps the mind to be more still and focused. And also keeping the back straight helps the mind to be more focused. And if you think you might get sleepy during this meditation, then it's best to not close your eyes completely, but leave them open a crack so there's some light coming in. And just have your eyes looking down onto your lap or onto the floor in front of you. So just take a few moments to try to settle your mind down in the present moment, right here, right now. So if there are thoughts in your mind of the past or the future, for example, you might be thinking about your plans for later today when we finish here, what you're going to do, where you're going to go, who you're going to talk to. So put those thoughts aside for now. Remember that you're still here in this place, in this moment. And any thoughts of the past as well. If you're thinking about things that happened earlier today or yesterday or any time in the past, put those thoughts aside as well. So just try to stay in the present moment. And focusing on your breathing is a helpful way to stay in the present, because that's happening in the present. So just be aware of your breath coming in, going out, and whatever sensations you may feel in your body, but without clinging to any of these, because none of them is permanent. Whatever experience happens is just a momentary experience. It happens and then it passes. So just observe it and let it go. And then be aware of the next one. going to ask you to, in a very careful way, to try to get a sense of your sense of I. Try to get in touch with a feeling of I. But you need to do this in a very careful way, as if you're a photographer and you want to take a photograph of some wild animal. And so you want to move very carefully and not make a lot of noise or do anything that would startle the animal so it would run away. So in a very careful way, look into your experience of your sense of self, your sense of I. So one way you could do it is to just try to get a sense of the self that you have right now. The sense of an I who's sitting here in this room, on the seat, the chair, the cushion you're sitting on, doing meditation. There's a sense of I am, I exist, I am here. If it's difficult to get that, another way would be to remember a time when you got very emotional about something. You got angry, upset, frightened, excited. So when you felt really strong emotion, then try to remember that experience. And then try to catch a glimpse of the I that was there behind the emotion or under the emotion, the I that was feeling excited or upset or frightened. So do your best to hold on to whatever sense of self or I that you were able to catch hold of. And even if you weren't, even if it slipped away before you could catch it, that's okay. You can still carry on with the meditation. Because now we're going to just analyze, investigate the qualities, the properties of this sense of self or I. So first, let's check to see if this I seems to be something permanent or impermanent. So earlier we were talking about the difference between permanent and impermanent. So impermanent means changing all the time, every minute, every second, constantly changing. Permanent means not changing, but staying the same. So just ask yourself, is my I, the sense of I, self, is it impermanent, constantly changing, or does it seem to be permanent, always there, always the same? So one way we could investigate this is to check if we feel that our I, the I that's existing right now, this moment, is it the same as the I of an earlier time? For example, this morning when you first woke up, or yesterday, something you did yesterday, or 5 years ago, or 10 years ago, or going back to an early part of your life when you were very young. So when we remember a past experience, a past event, do we have the feeling that we are the same person now that was existing then, during that experience? So in case you do think that you're not the same person, if you have the idea, no, I know I'm different, I've changed. But on the other hand, when we do remember past events, especially experiences that were maybe very painful for us or disturbing to us in some way, so when we remember those past events, do we still feel the same emotion now? Do we feel sad or upset or angry about that past event, as if we are the same person right now who had that experience a long time ago? So at this point in time, it's not really necessary to come to a conclusion about this. It's something we can continue to explore. In other words, we can continue to check, to explore the idea of ourself being something permanent or impermanent. So now let's move on to another way we might view our self, our sense of self. Do we see it as something whole, indivisible, one whole, solid, indivisible thing, as opposed to something that is composed of parts? Just explore that idea. Your sense of self, your sense of I, sense of me. Does it seem like just one whole thing? Or does it appear to be something made up of many parts? So we talked earlier about how we are made of different components, some physical things, like our different parts of our body, and those in turn are made up of smaller parts like cells, and those in turn are made of molecules, atoms, and so on. So we can break our body down into finer and finer parts. And our mind is also composed of different parts. Moment by moment, there are different minds, different experiences arising and passing. So if you have a sense of an I, self, the I being something that doesn't have parts, something indivisible, something whole, then what exactly is it? Which part of you is it? Is there some part of you, some part of your body, or some part of your mind that can't be broken down further into components? So again, you may not have reached a conclusion about that point, that question, but it's okay. It's something you can continue to explore more later. And now let's move on to a third question about our sense of self. And this is to check if our I, sense of self, or I, seems to be something that exists independently, doesn't depend on causes and conditions, not affected by any other factors, any causes, any conditions. So does it seem to be like that? Does it seem to be something that stands on its own, completely distinct, separate, independent, unrelated, unaffected by causes and conditions? Does it seem to be that way? So if that was true, if the I was able to exist in a completely independent way, that means that you wouldn't have depended upon your mother and father giving birth to you, bringing you up, teaching you, and so forth. It also means you would not need food, warmth, shelter, love, and so forth, the various necessities of life. You would be able to exist completely independent of those. So is that true? So again, you may not have managed to reach a final conclusion about that question, but that's okay. It's enough just to ask these questions of ourself, just to explore the sense of self, the sense of I, which seems to exist on its own, from its own side, very, very real, all by itself. So even to just start to question, to explore, to investigate the sense of self is already something quite helpful, quite beneficial. So when you feel ready to come out of the meditation, then you can slowly open your eyes, relax. So in that meditation, what we were exploring, what we were questioning was a certain type of self, a self that has these three qualities of being permanent, being whole or indivisible, and being independent of causes and conditions, able to exist by itself, not depending on causes and conditions. So it is said that at the Buddha's time and before the Buddha's time, at least some of the Indian philosophers and yogis, meditators, masters, believed that there was such a self. They had those three qualities: permanent, indivisible, and independent. And this was part of their teaching, part of their doctrine. So they taught their followers that there was this kind of a self. And I mean, the Buddha himself, the story is, he studied with some of these masters, learned what they taught, meditated on it, and so forth, but became dissatisfied, disillusioned, felt that this wasn't what he was looking for, so he left them and meditated on his own. And then in his own meditation, he came to see that that kind of self actually didn't exist. It was just constructed or fabricated by the mind, but not a real thing, not really existing. And so that's the most gross or coarse type of misconception about the self, believing a self to be permanent, unitary or indivisible, and independently existing. And then as we progress through the different schools of Buddhism, we come to more subtle types of misconceptions about the self, which are also investigated and eventually realized to be not true. But this is the more coarse one, and I think it's a good place to start, because probably we do. Although what they say in the Tibetan tradition is, at least Lama Tsongkhapa's tradition, it is said that believing in this type of self, permanent, unitary, and indivisible, is not something innate. It's not something inborn. It's not something everybody has from the time they are born. It's actually something that we learn only by, contact with religious or philosophical teachers who teach us this kind of self. So this is not something everybody has. This is what Lama Tsongkhapa says. So it may not be the case that we believe in a permanent, unitary, independent self unless we have studied with teachers, or whether religious or philosophical, who have taught us that kind of self. But it's good to investigate to see if we do have that kind of view or not, and then there are more subtle views of self that we probably do have, which are said to be inborn, innate, instinctive. Everybody has, but they are more subtle. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Because they say that, so there's like two different types of misconceptions or disturbing emotions. Some are said to be innate, instinctive. Everybody has them, even animals. And then there are other kinds of misconceptions or disturbing emotions that are acquired just by conditioning, by education, by learning. You know, we are taught those things, and so we accept them and believe in them, but they're not instinctive. Not everybody has them. So it's said that this view of a self, permanent, indivisible, and independent, is the second type of misconception. It's only learned from others, but not innate or instinctive. But the view of a inherently existing, completely inherently, independently existing self, that is something that is innate. The one that's refuted by the Madhyamika school. That is something innate. Everybody has it. Animals, insects, bugs, all beings have that one. So there's a little bit of time left. If you have any questions you'd like to ask.
I don't know, I was just trying to focus on this thinking about the self. I was just feeling and thinking that it was, I felt that it was almost like two selves. Like one around the heart region and one up here. So there is, I was thinking about how if you're trying to locate it, it doesn't feel like the self is down here in my legs. It feels
in
like
your toes.
That belongs to me. But
Yeah.
but then it's the sense of identifying. That's something that I was.
Yeah, I usually feel myself up here.
It's an observer there somehow. But also sometimes I feel like, I don't know, it's kind of.
Yeah. Well, they say this is the area connected with our feelings, our emotions. At least some emotions. Some emotions are also more connected
With the
in the stomach, the abdominal area. But yeah, when it comes to emotions, we often feel them here. But when it comes to more intellect, thinking, it seems to be up here. Yeah, it's interesting. When people point to themselves, like they say, me, where do you point?
Yeah.
Here, here. Japanese people point at their nose. So I don't know if that means anything. If that's something innate, instinctive, or culturally acquired, socially acquired. But don't we tend to point here, don't we? Yeah, interesting.
I have a question. When you experience to detach from your body, what is the part that is detaching from the body?
Do you say touch?
When you experience of detachment from the body.
Detachment,
yes,
are you saying?
when you see your body from outside.
Yeah.
What is the part that is going out of your body?
You have that experience?
Yes, when I was child. That's why I believe in reincarnation very
Yeah.
easily, without doubtful, because I have experienced many times in the morning, just waking up, then it disappeared when I became teenage, to see myself from outside when I was looking in the mirror. And now I don't know if it is the mind that it goes outside. And then I read in the later year that there are methodology to do that even when you sleep, or And it is the mind that is going out of the body, or what?
Yeah, this is an interesting phenomena. I don't know much.
About self. It is the self going out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know much about this myself, but there's people who have the ability to do lucid dreaming. Have you heard of that?
Yeah.
Lucid dreaming, and I've talked to someone who could do that just naturally. I mean, there are people who you can train in it, you can learn how to do it, but for some people it just happens naturally. Yes. And they, while they're asleep and dreaming, they're able to know that they're dreaming, and yeah, sometimes seeing themselves outside their body and looking at their body. Well, I don't know, but in Tantra, the Tantric teachings, that's where they have the explanation of these different levels of mind and body, gross, subtle, and very subtle. So both our body and our mind have these three levels, gross, subtle, and very subtle. And it seems that in that explanation, when we are asleep and dream, there's the subtle mind. How does it go? I can't remember exactly. No, there's something called a dream body. And that, I don't know if it always happens, but it can leave the body, goes out of the body and travels around, has adventures, and then comes back. And comes back when we wake up. And so...
Is it part of the mind?
It's... I'm trying to remember now. I have to check how that works.
It might also be subtle physical energy, maybe.
Because they say that at the very subtle level, our body and mind are not really separate. They're always together. The very subtle mind, very subtle body are inseparable, always together. So I think that, yeah, the dream body is a combination of the very subtle body and the very subtle mind. So it's both. But this is, I mean, it's completely different than this gross body made of flesh and blood. It's energy, yeah, very subtle kind of energy, which is always connected with the mind. So it seems that that would explain this phenomena, maybe what you're experiencing.
Still an aggregate, anyway.
That explanation is only found in Tantra, in Vajrayana. The other systems of Buddhism don't talk about the subtle mind and the subtle body. But it would still be included in the aggregates, but a subtler form of the aggregates.
Therefore, part of the self that we believe is permanent and but indeed it is also this subtle mind is not.
Well, it wouldn't
permanent,
be part of the self, it would be the basis of imputation of the self. Yeah. So it's like our aggregates, physical and mental aggregates, all this mass of physical and mental components is like the basis on which we give the label self, I, me, or whatever our name is. So the subtle mind, subtle body would be part of the basis for imputing self or I. So yeah, you could say it's part of you, part of the self, part of the I. But then...
Therefore, also not permanent, not indivisible and not independent.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can I just ask you a question?
Yeah.
How did you feel when you were outside your body?
This is another topic.
Okay.
But I can also control the dreams since I am a child. So, and I still do it.
Lucid dreaming. Yeah.
I mean, what you said, without techniques, or it's just
natural. Yeah.
And it's good that we know that also this is not self, because it's easy to say, okay, body is not self, but this part that I perceive outside the body self is there not true either.
It's also not.
It's important because then you can go to the opposite side and say, okay, we have a soul, and independently from the body, it flies, it goes around, and which is not true neither.
And
it
that
would be very easy to.
And that may be why these Indian philosophers, because they weren't just philosophers, many of them were mystics, meditators, yogis. They did a lot of meditation. And so maybe some of them had this kind of experience, going out of their bodies, and they really, oh, there is this soul, this independently existing self or soul. It was their experience, but they just came to what the Buddhists would say, a misinterpretation of their experience.
Yes.
Yeah, but I think their experiences were based, their views, their philosophy were based on actual experiences that they had. But it just,
Illusion as well.
and yeah, that's what the Buddha taught. Yeah. Anyway, last question. Otherwise, we're about the end of our time.
I just have a question. Is it very important to be very specific in the terms? Like, or is it...
Like what?
I don't know. And it's like, it has to be in... I don't know. It just feels like it's very specific and... I don't know, then you have to understand it in a specific way, and this is the truth, this is how you have to look at it. Is it not flexible also? I feel, I just want to question,
Well, terms themselves, I mean, those are just words, right? The words that are given to phenomena. So the important thing isn't the word or the term, but what it's talking about, what it's referring to. Like, for example, enlightenment, the word enlightenment. A lot of people use the word enlightenment. And sometimes you may have different people talking about enlightenment, but what they're actually talking about are very different things. So I always think it's, if you can have that kind of discussion, it's really important to define your term. Like, what do you mean by enlightenment? And then I can tell you what I mean by enlightenment. And then otherwise, we're...
that sounds more like... appellate to me.
Yeah. But then if I'm talking about enlightenment, I'm not talking from my experience. I'm just talking what the Buddha experienced. Yeah. So in some of these cases, we are talking about something that the Buddha experienced, or that these highly accomplished beings experienced. And this is what they said about it. This is how they described it. But ideally, what we want is to be able to get to that experience ourselves, to reach that experience, be on that same level of experience, and then we know what they're talking about. But until that happens, we just have to rely on the words that they used. So sometimes it is useful to try to stick to the same words rather than invent other words. You know what I mean? Just so that we try not to go too far away from
Yeah, but
the original.
In specific schools, it was very important to think that in that school. And
Yeah.
like very,
Yeah.
it's very like...
But when, like the monks and nuns, when they study these texts, they're full of definitions. We're not going into that kind of detail, but almost every term has a definition. And they say it's quite important, because the definition is sort of sets boundaries, It's this, but it's not that. So then you you get a very clear understanding of what it is you're talking about. What is the mind? What is form? What is enlightenment, and so forth. And then it becomes more specific rather than just vague and kind of airy-fairy. And that's what they do in debating as well. Yeah. They're debating about, about these things. Okay, so let's finish there. And so we still have more sessions tomorrow, but I thought tomorrow to make it more like a retreat, not going into so many philosophical things, but doing meditations. So I haven't yet decided what, but I thought maybe good to do some meditations on compassion and love, because today was very much focused on the wisdom side of things, and good to balance it with the method side, the heart side of compassion and love. So let's finish by making a dedication of what we've done here today. So we came together and spent several hours together doing some meditation, listening, thinking about, talking about these teachings on the path to enlightenment. And we tried to have a good motivation for what we were doing, wishing to benefit others, the world as much as possible, to bring about freedom from suffering, to bring about peace and happiness, to bring about enlightenment. So doing all these things with a good motivation means we have created some good energy, some positive energy, what we call merit in Buddhism. Merit brings about happiness and peace and progress on the path to enlightenment. So we can share this merit with others. And by doing that, we actually increase the merit, not that we lose it or decrease it. It actually expands, increases. So let's imagine our merit growing and expanding and reaching out and covering all living beings everywhere. And let's wish that what we have done here today will bring peace, happiness, benefit, freedom from suffering, wisdom, compassion, love, and all the things that are needed by others, by the world, to end suffering, to end war, to end hatred, violence, terrorism, to bring peace, happiness, harmony, and to bring all of us closer to enlightenment. Okay, so thank you, and have a good evening. The sun is still out.